okay? If you didn't have a concept of bat, if you didn't know what flying was, a bat has wings, but does he know what a wing is? If you don't have a concept of wings, then how would you know, additionally, to paraphrase Antonio Damasio, would you also be able to know that you were flying with your wings? And we're going to talk about seeing with your eyes a little bit later, so keep that in mind. I just threw this in here for fun. There's a little biological stuff. But here's the upper arm bones in a human, a pterodactyl, a bird, and a bat. And then the lower arm bones, radius and ulna, okay? And then here's the metacarpals. They're the bones in your hand and then your fingers, okay? Well, the metacarpals are way back here in pterodactyl, and this big long finger and these short fingers are his wing. The bird's hand bones are fused, and so are really, so when you eat a chicken wing, it's those last couple digits that are fused together, okay? But the bat, his hand and finger bones are really most of his wing, and he flaps. It'd be like flapping with your hands, okay?
So we're going to bone to bats.
So So Thomas Nagel, I would call, what is like to be a bat, the old Mysterians. The new Mysterians, a guy named Colin McGinn, philosopher again, said we cannot, in principle, understand consciousness. He did a recent paper, I think it was 89, yeah, 89. We cannot, in principle, understand consciousness because of cognitive closure. Okay, these are philosophers talking, not neuroscientists. He said, we don't have the concepts to describe or explain consciousness. We can't do it. So, as an example, a monkey will never understand electricity because he doesn't have the proper concepts. I buy that. Conceptual poverty, right? He can't grok consciousness. Does anybody know what grok comes from? Any science fiction? This is too old for you guys. Ever read Robert Heinlein? Anybody ever read Robert Heinlein? Stranger in a Strange Land? He used the term grok, and I love that word. It means like completely understand. If you really grok something, you got it. You know what I mean? Anyways, so according to McGinn, we can frame the problem, we can define it, but we can't solve it. We have not the conceptual ability in principle, according to Mr. McGinn. And this, I took this quote from him because he starts comparing that we should follow the theologians. Somebody says, as soon as somebody says something like that, I jump on it. Of course, rather as traditional theologians have found themselves conceding cognitive closure with respect to certain properties of God, so we should look seriously at the idea that the mind-body problem brings us bang up against the limits of our capacity to understand the world. He's an Irishman. He said bang up. He must be Catholic. I don't know. So we should emulate the theologians. Not, okay. So McGinn's argument is it's because our perception is not able to represent consciousness because our perception is built on spatial orientation. And he says that limits us to understanding consciousness. That's his. My response to that, and it's not just my response, in the fine company of many others more learned than I, mainly neuroscientists who are working on the problem, my comment is, we'll see. Okay? Whenever a philosopher, Nagel, McGinn, and even Sam Harris coming up soon, in principle says, I gotta figure out how to cue all this stuff, in principle says, we can't know anything. Oh yeah? So watch this. This is Jacob Bernowski from The Ascent of Man. If you've never seen this series, you need to. You're not educated yet. So much for in principle arguments. Okay. I can't take that. Next slide. Sam Harris goes down the same road. Harris is agnostic towards whether we can ever really reduce consciousness to physical experience, that we could ever explain it by understanding the brain. The idea that consciousness is identical to or emerged from unconscious physical events is impossible to properly conceive. So a couple people have mentioned Sam is in the camp with the new Mysterians. And Sam denies the soul, and he's very much a materialist. He's a neuroscientist, and if you know Sam Harris's writing and all, he tears up all the fanciful religions. Then when he gets to consciousness, he kind of walks kind of a backdoor dualist line. So he says, the truth is, we simply do not know what happens after death. Ron, would you like to answer that?
I couldn't. I remember when I was a teenager, you wake up in the middle of the night and you realize, I'm going to die. And you can't conceive of death after having lived. It paralyzes you, which I think it drives people to religion. So, all right, they say there's no evidence as to what's going to happen after, after death. So maybe you have a soul, maybe it's going to be an afterlife. Well, think about what it was like before your brain existed. Think what it was like before you were born. You have no recollection. It doesn't bother you one damn bit that you missed the first half of infinity. Think about it. So when you don't have a brain again, when your brain decomposes and you die, there will be no consciousness, there will be no you, and it won't bother you one damn bit. So there's nothing to fear in death, So nothing happens.
Yeah.
That's what happened. Nothing.
I'm just amazed.
Absolutely nothing.
I'm amazed at this statement.
Because we have evidence. We know what it was like
Totally
before we had a
amazed.
brain.
When brains die, behaviors disappear, so does consciousness. And 3,000 years of wishful thinking by the reincarnation religions has never shown any existence, any proof of a soul. 150 years of neuroscientists, nothing survives beyond brain death. Okay, and he goes against, well, there is much to be said against a naive conception of the soul, okay, that is independent of the brain, good. The place of consciousness in the natural world is very much open to question. So he kind of substitutes consciousness for soul and keeps his dualism that way. The idea that brains produce consciousness is little more than an article of faith among scientists at present. There's reasons to believe that the methods of science will be either insufficient to either prove or disprove it. I think most neuroscientists would argue with Sam on that one. So here's more of things Sam has to say. We will not make any progress by drawing analogies between starfish behavior and our own. Okay? Starfish seem to be pretty primitive, and we're going to talk about them in a few minutes. It is only in the presence of animals sufficiently like ourselves is there something like to be a cocker spaniel, a more elaborate type animal. To say that consciousness emerged at some point in the evolution of life doesn't give us an inkling of how it could emerge from unconscious processes, and Sam took too much philosophy, even in principle. Oh yeah? Let's wait and see. My reply, if he says, in principle we can't discover consciousness and it can't be reduced to the brain, then why study cocker spaniels at all? Because their behavior is more similar to ours, but how did they get that behavior? From their brain. They actually have a mammalian brain. A starfish doesn't even have a brain. So, on one hand he says, science will never find it, but then on the other hand he says, let's study cocker spaniels and things more like us. Well, wait a minute, that behavior didn't just fall out of the sky, it's mediated by a more complex nervous system. So, makes no sense here. You already said it was in principle hopeless, but now let's study more complex nervous system. That makes no sense. So, is the study of the conscious in hopeless? Is it in principle unsolvable? Cue Descartes, I think not. Harris appears to propose that science can't resolve consciousness. Now, if you read The End of Faith, chapter 8, he goes on about how religions are stupid and we can't reduce consciousness. Therefore, Eastern religions, mainly the reincarnation religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, mostly Buddhism for his, that meditation can somehow solve the problem of consciousness, and that's the only way to find it. It's kind of God of the gaps type of argument. So he says science can't resolve it, so that therefore Eastern mysticism, and that's a whole other lecture, through meditation which eliminates the self can. And a few mystics claim to know they experienced the world without a self, shorn of self. And my answer is, how would they know? They weren't there, right? If the self is gone, how do you know you're experiencing anything? The whole deal is to get rid of the self, and then you're going to tell me, oh, well, I experienced the world without the self. How would you know? You weren't there. So for that, we're going to cue my favorite comic of all time, Jackie Mason, and he'll talk to you about the real search for the self. Best philosophy ever, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. This is Paul Churchill, and if you haven't read Paul Churchill, you need to.
I found the book.
You found the book. Paul Churchill is my favorite of all time philosophers of science and mind. I think he's phenomenal. I heard him speak 20 years ago. And Paul Churchill says this, perhaps we should not be too impressed, therefore, by the puzzling nature of consciousness. The appearance of unique mystery and permanent inaccessibility to standard science may reflect only our own ignorance and current conceptual poverty, my emphasis, rather than any special metaphysical status possessed by consciousness itself. And Paul goes on to give us some really excellent examples, and I'll give you one. And Ben, you already mentioned some planets we just found tonight, you know, what they're made of and stuff, right? And they're light years away, right? Well, in the 1800s, when what the stars were made of was on Auguste Comte, another philosopher, said in principle, it's unknowable. We will never know the composition of the stars. They're too far away. We have no information. We have no way of getting there. Well, that was before Newton had already discovered the spectra and the elements, but modern astrophysics, just even decades in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, we started reading the spectra of light coming from the stars and realizing different elements burn and give off different spectra, okay? So he said, in principle, we can never know anything of their chemical or mineralogical structure. And now, of course, we can planets, stars, everything all around us. Again, in principle arguments coming out of philosophers, you know, cue Descartes. I think not, right? So I'm looking at the modern day mysteriums of consciousness. How presumptuous. You guys should know better. Neuroscience has maybe had 150 years of real operation, and really only the last 50 years, maybe only in the last 20 years, of really intense imaging and neuroscience that's going on now, and it's extrapolating. So it's a little early to call it in principle impossible, I think. I think the idea of conceptual poverty is really key, and it ties into my own research. While our own conceptual poverty may be temporary if you're in any given domain, like knowing about the stars or whatever, other animals may not have anything like the evolved conceptual apparatus of the human animal, and that's what I study and starting to study in my research. They may be permanently limited to that mere sentience. They can feel, they can experience, they're alert, they're awake, they have a brainstem that turns them on and off just like ours, but they have no concepts with which to experience anything like human consciousness. And I put Reverend Bill there because right now that's complete bullshit. I don't have anything to back it up yet. That's just that's as bad as a theological statement as I can make, but I'm going to try and back it up someday. So let me jump to somebody, again, much smarter than I, and this is Dan Povinelli, and he's going to give you a little bit of an idea of why we think all the other animals, starting with our closest genetic relatives, are conceptually impoverished compared to us. And this is from the Human Spark PBS video series from a couple years ago. It's absolutely excellent. Alan Alda from MASH is in it. It's really good. When I first saw this, I was like, from a developmental standpoint, she doesn't have the vocabulary to say weight. So she says strong, and it sounds funny to us. But then the more I thought about it, she's actually explaining the concept she has. The strong ball can do things. It can do work. Because it's heavy, it has the property of strength, action, it can knock the other ball out. So she's actually explaining what she's really thinking, even though in our vocabulary it sounds kind of primitive. She does this, and she's feeling the pull of gravity against her gravity responsive muscles, okay, that would hold her arm up. That's what we call embodied cognition. She has the concept of weight because this means something to her. This one, she doesn't have the vocabulary for it, so she just goes, see, weighs nothing, and she throws it, it's nothing. Whereas the other one takes your hand down, okay? And embodied cognition, I think, is something that, again, the other animals don't have, and I'll talk about that evolutionarily in a little bit.